All settled in the back down there? A little rowdy in the back. I don't know. Nothing. Just making sure we're all good. We're ready to go. Okay, well, good. Then I'll get started. I'll introduce Eric Swisher with All4. He has more than 20 years of professional experience in the air quality consulting field and serves as a senior technical lead for All4's continuous emissions monitoring systems, or CMS, area of practice. He's responsible for implementing strategic monitoring programs, training, audits, and ongoing compliance support. I have to read that. I work with him a lot, but I want to make sure I get the words right. You know, it's good. So with that, Katie's here, but I don't have anything on Katie, so they're going to share with what's going on there. So there you go, Katie.
So I'll leave Katie's introduction when she jumps in and gives a little, you know, her part of the presentation. I'll allow her to do introductions at that point.
You will allow her.
Huh?
You will allow her.
We'll allow that. Yes.
Okay.
So today we were kind of looking at, you know, where are we? We have a lot of MACT standards, the chemical MACTs that are coming, you know, up with compliance deadlines, and where are we in that process? Where should we be, and what should we be doing around that right now to really hone in on those things that we may not foresee or anticipate? And there we go. The way that, you know, where we are in that process, and I have some dates coming up here, is we're at a point that, hey, we've got things on paper. We hopefully got things on paper. We got things identified. We've got, you know, some resources, what we need to do, and what systems maybe we need to go out and procure, or maybe we're already part of that procurement process. But really, when it comes down to figuring out exactly what else we may need to consider, going through kind of the workflow is something that we're doing now with folks along this process to determine, okay, it's great, it's written down. Let's actually think through a situation or scenarios where we can identify those people that are affected by this, and then what resources do they need? And what you find is it kind of spider webs out into a whole bunch of different areas that maybe you didn't consider. And hopefully you're able to kind of put something in place to, you know, build or fill those gaps prior to, you know, compliance deadlines. And if we look at some of these MACs and these compliance deadlines, you know, coming up, we've got ethylene MAC, OLD, and MON with various different, you know, compliance dates. You know, you're talking 2023 timeframe where MON has a kind of a phased in for different things. But basically, we have kind of that target, right? We have a target of where we need to be. And we have kind of various different aspects of here's along the journey of that 3-year period that EPA promulgated the final rule until when we need to income compliance. Where should we be, and what items, you know, should we have accomplished? And, you know, because we're kind of right in that, that middle of that 2022. So, you know, we're getting close to, you know, coming into compliance, especially for the EMAC, which will be the, you know, the first one there. So when you go through kind of that process, you can see there's a lot of stuff there to the left that, you know, in some aspects should already be completed, right? Where we kind of went through the impacts of, you know, what the regulatory evaluation, how does this impact me from a regulatory perspective? What compliance strategies are we looking at? You know, do we have new work practice standards, we have new monitoring strategies, we have record keeping and reporting strategies. We have the strategies. The strategies are great, right? Because those strategies help us form the plans. So then we have plans like the flare management plan and CPMS monitoring plan. You also have some LDAR, you know, management programs that most likely will affect, you know, standard operating procedures as such. But as soon as you start to take the compliance strategy and the regulatory plan, you start to put it down on paper, you're not done, right? Because now you've really got to figure out who does this impact, and do they have the tools and the equipment and the people to actually, the processes and the systems to do what they need to do, what's in that plan. So when you look kind of at the analysis and the impact that, typically these things are not developed in a vacuum. So you most likely have formulated kind of a stakeholders group, if you will, involved in the development of these requirements. Hey, here's the regulatory requirements. We have those outlined. How does it impact all these different entities? And you can see your stakeholders team can be quite, large. I mean, you get environmental's kind of the one that usually drives the regulatory requirements, but instrumentations are the realists that say, okay, you want to do this, the regulations say this, so how are we actually going to do it? How are my guys in the field going to pull this, going to execute what's in the plan? And sometimes will it work? Right? You got engineering, you got people actually maybe engineering solutions. I have to put things in pipes and monitor things certain areas. I've got to engineer things. Operations, are looking at through a completely, different aspect is, okay, this is my new work practice standard. Here's how I need to be operating, my affected sources. Well, I need to be having these things in place, and they could be consistent with standard operating procedures. It could be training. There's a lot of different elements associated with their stakeholders. And you can get down like IT. I mean, we're going to be communicating across networks. They're going to need to be involved. You got DCS, you got process control group that actually saying, okay, I'm getting all this data. I've got to control things. I've got to get that, designed. I got to buy things, right? So procurement's going to be heavily involved in the actual acquisition of those things that are identified through the process. Even things like security, right? Because security, sometimes the cameras, the visible emissions in the cameras are owned by security, because a lot of the cameras may be utilized for security purposes, or all the data retention or all the image retention is done through security. So they may have a stake in it. And then, not to mention, you have all your consultants and vendors who have their own piece of this, right? They've been asked to accomplish little pieces of the task. And from this, from going through the analysis, you kind of come up with action items. And we think of action items as not just these little pieces. It's from the end, which is the record keeping and the reporting, back to that evaluation. So it's the start to the finish. You have to go all the way to the end to figure out what those pieces can look like. So when you go through the evaluation activities, you're looking at impacted sources. I mean, we're hopefully well past that, at this point. And then when you have the impacted sources, what are those regulatory requirements? What do I need to be doing for those? Because outside of those regulatory requirements, you have those work practice standards, right? And those work practice standards, for decoking operation, there's new work practice standards. For pressure release devices, there's new work practice standards. Tanks, flares, heat exchangers, there's new ways that we need to be operating these systems. And we can identify the regulatory requirements, but somehow we've got to get these things in practice and get these things implemented and integrated in a manner in which they can actually be done out in the out in the field, or out in operations. So when you look at, the valuation, we also got things like we talked about work practice standards, but we also got monitoring implications. We got to monitor a lot more. We got to monitor things for PRDs. We got to monitor things for flares. We got new LDAR requirements. So there's systems and there's processes that are going to have to be in place to support these type of monitoring implications. Again, we can write it down what the requirement is, but how are we going to integrate it? How are we going to implement it? And how are we going to procure that type of equipment and have those resources necessary for us when we're on site to do and accomplish those tasks. And then you've got other things like removal, the startup shutdown, malfunction. How are we going to operate differently now? What are our work practice standards around SSM, and those SSM provisions that were there are no longer there. So now we've got to figure out how operations and how we are going to, minimize, emissions during those periods, and what are we going to put in place. That could even be process controls. It could be, SOPs, more operator training. There's a lot of things now that we are on that timeline. We're kind of that year out. We've got to be thinking about, okay, come compliance date, when we have all this stuff, how's it going to be implemented out there, and how are we going to, pull the trigger on to make sure that we're able to execute that when we are, coming into compliance. So if you look at the planned workflow, I mean, now like I said, we have these documents and we say, okay, we have a flare management plan. We have a CPMS monitoring plan. We have these sites, SOPs, these site standard operating procedures. We have to take these And now we've got to think through the workflow and who they impact. And what Katie's going to do is Katie's going to take and look at a flare monitoring workflow and basically just kind of go through something as simple as what we see in a CPMS monitoring plan. CPMS monitoring plan has the regulatory requirements. Katie's going to go through kind of what the contents need to be. And the regulatory requirement, they meet it. But there's so much more to it when you start thinking about very, workflow type questions that Katie will go through. So Katie, what I'll do is I'll turn over and don't remember your introduction, and we'll go through, let Katie go through a couple things on the work practice.
All right. I'm Katie Fritz. I work on our CMS tech team at All4 with Eric, and I do a lot of work in the chemical industry and the refining industry, so pretty well versed in this stuff at this point. So like Eric mentioned, the CPMS monitoring plan or continuous parameter monitoring plan contains a description of the monitoring equipment and the justification for why you selected it. So for example, if you're using an ultrasonic flow meter to monitor the vent gas flow rate, you may have selected that type of technology to meet the accuracy requirements and your composition of your gas, your flow rates. So understanding why you're selecting the equipment and then detailing that in the plan is very important. Additionally, if you're using any type of redundant systems, maybe you have both a mass spec and a calorimeter as a backup. Again, you want to detail all of that in your CPMS plan. Additionally, we would detail the routine quality assurance and quality control procedures. So any type of initial certification and ongoing QA activities. The previous presentation we had before this one talked a lot about PS9. So if you have a mass spectrometer, you would be following the PS9 requirements. So again, detailing exactly what you're doing on a routine basis in this plan is very important, and why you're doing it. If there's any gray area, this is the place to put your reasoning and your justification for your decisions. Your maintenance activities are also in the CPMS plan. So your preventative maintenance procedures and your corrective maintenance procedures. Like Eric spoke about, this could touch a lot of different people, your techs especially. So having very clear procedures, standard operating procedures is important to detail here. The CPMS monitoring plan also contains a description of the data collection and reduction system. So this is the place where you should have all of your details on how calculations are being done, averaging periods. If any of that data is being used for process controls, this is another place where you would want to document that. So if any of that information is being used by operations for any type of control systems, everybody needs to be aware of that, because if something changes, it impacts a lot of different people. So this is where you want to kind of clear up that black box and make it very clear what your facility is doing and how you are complying with the regulations. So Eric kind of talked about this workflow, which is kind of the theme of our presentation here. So we need to understand the requirements. So what is the activity, the frequency, the tolerances? If you have daily calibrations that you're doing, what resources or equipment do you need to conduct those daily activities? So obviously we need manpower, but also cylinder gases. So do we have enough cylinder gases on hand? And again, this involves procurement. So there's a lot of different people at play that you have to kind of start thinking through this now and how it's all going to play together. Additionally, notifications. Who will be notified? How will they be notified if, for example, you fail a daily calibration? You need to tell environmental operations probably needs to know that the data they're seeing isn't good. So there's a lot of different people who need to know what's happening. So having a procedure for who and how you're doing that is really important. And then actions as well. So if we get an alarm on a system, something's malfunctioning, who's going to respond to that alarm? How quickly do they have to respond to it? And then who do they notify? And how do they document what was done? If you have to go look back a month later to understand that, we need clear documentation, because you may also have to report that for compliance reasons. So we're going to focus in on the action a little bit. So who will be required to respond to activities? Again, with the corrective maintenance program, there's a lot to think through here. So what are your procedures? Who was doing it? On what frequency? Spare parts as well. This is something to start thinking through. Who's going to procure those spare parts? What do you need? Who's managing them? It's easy to write it down in a plan, but to actually put it into practice involves a lot of different players and stakeholders. And then data validation. We need to know if the data is good or bad. So who is handling that data validation? We need to let operations know if the data is good or bad that they're seeing. And then also record keeping and reporting, like we spoke about, making sure you're documenting what corrective maintenance was done, and then reporting it in any type of quarterly, semi-annual reports that you would need to. So now Eric is going to go through the gap analysis and help connect some of the dots.
And like Katie mentioned, you can see how just the one little thing about routine compliance, when you go through who's doing it and how we're getting it done, it starts to spider web out into all these other things, right? And those other things are the things we need to be considering now, since we have kind of our hands or head around what needs to be done, maybe something written down on paper. We're a year out, a little over a year out. We can actually now start to figure some things out. Or if we haven't figured out, maybe revisit. The one thing that Katie mentioned about spare parts, that's a regulatory requirement. You need to have spare parts on site to, adequately address downtime for your monitoring equipment. Well, the critical spare parts list is changing because the uncertainty in procuring that equipment. The supply chain is messed up, right? Things that we used to be able to get yesterday and overnight, no problem, are now taking a long time. And going back and revisiting anything that maybe you have done in light of what we're doing or where the situation from the supply chain is something that you really need to go back and maybe dust off, because that type of those type of readily available parts, consumables even, sometimes might not be readily available. We actually got a self plug, I guess, for tomorrow. We're doing a supply best practices for procuring monitoring equipment, and it's basically up to date information with myself and control analytics on lead times and where they were and where they are now. So it gives you a sense and even some costs with respect to what we're seeing different in different costs. So understanding that nature and where we are and things that are changing is very important. And that spare parts and that workflow process is something to kind of go through, when you kind of plan for that. So if we look at the gap analysis, so typically where we are, and that workflow is kind of that first step to a gap analysis. If we take where you are and we start saying, okay, let's think through this from an implementation standpoint, where are some of the areas where we can anticipate breakdown, or we can foresee, breakdown that we want to kind of patch up, if you will, those gaps. And one of them is kind of the regulatory role gaps. I mean, regulatory analysis were done and complete, but we're still finding a little bit of like, yeah, but I have a consent decree that requires, or I'm subject to the HRVOC rule in Texas and I'm good. Well, no, because there's little nuances between what CC says and what you may already be subject to that are very, very like specific to the regulation, right? So it's just something that is just in the weeds type nuances, but that's where we are right now, is we have to kind of identify those gaps and plug those holes. And then the implementation, like we talked about, is that there's breakdown or there's anticipated breakdown within that workflow. I have things I have to do, I have them written down, but when I go to implement them, there's a piece here. Who's going to be notified when I have to do certain things? Or after I have a, release from a PRD, I have to go back and retest and revisit that. So how's that management system working, and how's that functioning, and how's that all going to come together? Monitoring certification activities. We should be thinking about that right now, because although we're procuring the monitoring, we're putting it in, I've got to go through initial certification activities, right? So I've got to really start planning for those, because they can be an effort that it's going to take some time. And also a lot of the GCs or the mass specs for PS9, it's new, and it's new for people. So how are we going to go ahead and pull that together? So when we do a notification of compliance status, that we say, yeah, we have these systems in place, and yes, they're initially certified. The data handling is always something. I mean, we're still addressing that in the refining sector, right? Because we have data that's kind of coming in, but now that we got it, what are we doing with it from a compliance standpoint, from a reporting standpoint? Because a lot of times it was given, but there wasn't any thought to putting system. Once I have it, what do I do with it now? And then I have to be able to generate reports so I can submit things appropriately, to the agency. Not only submit, but notify. One of the main processes, these work practice standards, or the notification step, is I have data coming in. I'm doing what I need to do with that data, and I need to notify when there's an exception or something's wrong, right? And then how am I going to tie that with process controls, and how are they different, right? A lot of times what we see is we see maybe too much focus on one or the other, too much focus on environmental, that process controls will look at and say, okay, well, I'll just use that from environmental, but it really doesn't work for process controls because it's, say, for flare monitoring, it's 15-minute block, right? So if I'm operating a flare, I can't wait 15 minutes. I need to do this stuff, more every minute, so maybe you're calculating it in two different places from a process control standpoint. Or I'm focusing on process controls and there's no emphasis on, okay, well, what about my compliance engine? I'm taking all this data for process controls that has things that need to be considered for process controls, but it truly isn't my compliance demonstration. So I got to bridge that gap as well. Then that leads right into that record keeping and reporting from a regulatory perspective. I have obligations. I have obligations to try to do that as efficiently as I can. And that thing needs to be mapped out. Who's going to keep these records? Where are they maintained? And how are these reports, going to be generated? And what is going to be, that process? The gap right now, we mentioned that procurement uncertainty. I mean, if we have folks that POs should be kind of, in play right now, if for those of that are coming into, compliance, say with the ethylene act, I mean, you said over a year, POs are very, very important to get in place right now. One, because we have vendors that are saying 3 days. This quote's good for 3 days because we don't know what Monday's going to bring, right? And POs are also important because if you get in a situation from an extension standpoint that's outside of your control, this supply chain issue, like a GC is up to 48 weeks right now. In some instances, that's almost a year to get a GC. So if those procurement things aren't, the POs aren't being issued, you may already be outside of your window from getting into compliance. But POs are a good faith effort that you can point to say, I issued them. The lead times that are typically this are now this, and I may need to enter, with an extension from the monitoring around, these upcoming MAC standards. Also in the presentation tomorrow, we are going to be talking a little bit about that regulatory aspect. So the supply chain issue, the impacts of monitoring, but then also, kind of what the process looks like from an extension request. We also could be consider some air permitting, streamlining, right? So we have, for example, flare requirements that are now going to be max CC. Well, there's also flare requirements in the general provisions, right? The general provisions may be incorporated into your permit. So one thing that under the Ethylene Act, it's very clear is that the Ethylene Act said, well, when you're in compliance with CC, they supersede subpart A, the general provisions. But if you have the general provisions listed in your permit, the Ethylene Act always says we can't override your Title V permit. So there's a process of going through and tying what you're doing now for flares to what you may have been doing. And it could be a general requirement. It could be tied to a BACT. It could be in a consent decree. So just kind of any type of permitting that needs to happen around just streamlining and cleaning it up, right? Because if we are going to be demonstrating compliance with something new and more stringent, we don't want to be deviating with more than one requirement. Let's just try to get them all together. When we have a deviation, we have one deviation, not deviation with the requirements of max CC for flares, in addition to the requirements of the general provisions for flares, because we haven't connected those dots from a permitting perspective. And then training. One of the things we go through and we identify these, and one of the questions like, okay, so what's your plan on rolling this stuff out? A lot of folks are relying on automation from a process control standpoint. Don't worry, it's going to be all automated. Okay. A lot of, and even from a data acquisition side, we've got these systems in place to make it more automated, but still people have got to be aware of those changes and how they are going to be, that first line of defense. A control console, an operator needs to know that, hey, when I see this value coming in for net heating value, or I see out of control, or I see a bad signal coming in, I know that now I have to operate the flare in this manner. And I need to notify these people to get this thing fixed, right? So that workflow. Traditionally, if you have SEMs and stuff, it's going to be similar, but SEMs are not really integrated into process controls a lot of times, and they're usually on a larger, averaging period than the 15 minutes. So if we look at some of the takeaways, from today, is that take a look at what through a new lens, right? We have time. We want to say, okay, let's workflow this. Let's figure out who does what, draw, a line chart or whatever. This happens, he sees it, he calls this guy happens, this guy needs this equipment to do it, just kind of think of it in that manner. And then you start thinking about it, start getting to a point, so saying, okay, we got resources here. And those resources are people, system, processes, equipment. I mean, it's like it's going to extend over a large entity there. And then now we identified more resources. How are we going to implement and integrate? So we're going to have SOPs, training. How are we going to pull all these pieces together in a manner in which we can actually execute on what we need to be executing on? Notification. That's the one thing too and another thing that we see is who is going to be that person who reaches out to someone and says, something's not right. How are we going to know? And how are we going to, take action? A lot of times in the refining sector, what we're seeing now is a little bit of a reactive nature to things like, say, flare monitoring, to where I'm just going to go ahead and report anytime I have visible emissions at my flare. The intent is not just to review film from yesterday. The intent is to catch it and fix it. That's why EPA gives you those 5 minutes, because in their interpretation, they're like, you see it, you catch it, you fix it, right? That notification and who's responsible to take action is quick. It's real time. And operators are looking at screens. They're looking at visible emissions. There should be adjusting the steam or whatever to kind of make those visible emissions go away. So that notification is more of an in the moment to correct, not after the fact. And it's going to be a point of contention, I believe, in some point in the future where hey, we had visible emissions. What did you do? We just reported them. That's not the intent. The spirit is to take actions in that moment. That's why there's a couple things that are pretty innovative out there now with artificial intelligence. They're actually doing image analysis, and they are basically being able to affect process controls and also report in the data acquisition system that I see visible emissions, right? So in the moment, somebody can say, I see it, I can take manual action, I see it, it's actually controlling the flare, maybe increasing the steam a little bit, and then also communicating the data acquisition system to say, hey, I'm starting to roll up these minutes, right? And it's pretty effective. It's really getting to that point where there are proof of concepts, out there. It's getting better every single day. And then also finally is just think about the end result. Where do we need to be from our record keeping and reporting? We could be generating a lot of records, but what are those records going to be used for? How they're going to be maintained? And then ultimately, how are we going to compile those things and report those? So with that, any questions?